Hi everyone, welcome to another S6 history class. Up until this point, we've been talking about the Second World War. You saw in the previous recording that Hitler launched a final dramatic, massive and desperate offensive against the Allies in the Ardennes region. His objective was to break through the Allied line, reach Antwerp, capture it, and then eventually defeat the Allies, force them to surrender. Okay, fortunately for the Allies, they were able to beat back Hitler, push them back, and then break their line, and then continue their advance on Berlin. Hitler would hide in a bunker and seeing the situation and being consistent in his, you know, viewpoint with regard to the war, that it was victory or total destruction for Germany and the Allies. Seeing that there was no hope, he committed suicide, and then eventually the remaining leaders of Germany, they would surrender to the Allied powers. Now, today we're going to focus on um, another theater of the war, or another place where the Second World War took place and unfolded. So I'm talking about the Pacific theater, so the theater in Asia. As you can see here, and as we've seen over and over again, as we in our discussions of the First and the Second World Wars, these opposing sides, they employed all the implements, instruments, anything that could hand them the advantage in these conflicts, and that included propaganda. Here's an example of how the Americans portray um, you know, the opposing side. As you can see here, it's at the very least, to put it mildly, it's rather problematic. And images like this is also controversial, are also controversial because this one in particular was drawn by Dr. Seuss, so the famous author of children's books. What we see here, what what is obvious here is uh, is the growing tension, really, that involving the Americans and these other world powers, and the way the Americans portrayed their enemies. At the same time, the stakes, the choices and what was involved in those choices that the U.S. had to make. Here is an outline of the things we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a bit of background information on the Japanese and American reactions to the Japanese, their ambitions, their responses to the actions of the other, the growing tensions in the region, in the Pacific, okay, the 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 expectations, the objectives of the Japanese as well as the Americans, and then the fatal decision of the Japanese to launch a surprise attack on the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Okay. Now, just a bit of a backgrounder. Imagine Japan in the 1920s. You know, Japan has been trying to modernize itself, but even before the 1920s, you know, in the years of the First World War, we understand that the Europeans and the US, they were preoccupied, you know, tied down by the war. And that was an opportunity for Japan to take over some of the trading, some of the economic activities in the region, in the Pacific. So by the early 20s, it was becoming clear to observers that Japan was intending to dominate affairs, trade in the region in the Pacific. The US, growing more alarmed, pressured Japan to sign treaties so that they would reduce their navy, they would interfere less in China so that their ambitions could be checked. The Europeans and the US also imposed tariffs, taxes on Japanese goods. So from the point of view of Japanese leaders, this was, an obvious threat to their ambitions, to their own efforts to grow. So one of the Japanese leaders, for instance, General Tojo, he would later become the War Minister of Japan and then eventually the Prime Minister. He would become um, his calls for a Japanese empire in the Pacific would become louder. So he saw more and more clearly that the Japanese had to establish an empire in the region. And then, you know, the Japanese would become even more aggressive. In 1931, they would invade Manchuria. Now, there are, of course, economic reasons for this. Manchuria is resource rich. The Japanese at this time were suffering from the Great Depression. Remember the Wall Street crash in 1929, American economy, the stock market crashed, the economy followed, and then Germany was also one of the hardest hit. So Japan was also feeling the effects of the Great Depression. Okay. Now, no action was taken against Japan. This was partly because, you know, other powers understood that Japan had already been involved in the region in this particular area since the late 19th century. And to some degree they had the right to claim, from a certain point of view, to claim this territory. Also because they were the victors in the conflict against the Russians in 1904 and 1905. On the part of the Japanese, they justified their actions by saying, look, you know, we turned Manchuria into an independent state, and which a territory that even has, at that point has its own leader, the last Chinese emperor. Okay, so that was Japan's justification. Nobody believed that, but nevertheless, nobody took action. Now, the Japanese don't stop there. After the invasion of Manchuria, they move further down the country. They move southwards, so they advance into the south. And remember, by 1936, the Japanese they enter into an agreement with Germany, an anti-communist agreement. By 1937, they launch a full-scale invasion of China. They reach as far as Beijing. They keep on moving south. By 1938, they reach Shanghai. Okay, as you can see on the map, they really go down there. So, in the context of the Second World War, it's good to understand that by 1938, before the Second World War starts, on the eve of that global conflict, Japan was in control of the eastern part of China. In addition to that, it's good to understand that China was also having internal problems of its own. Okay, so China at this point was some parts of it were ruled by Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, this nationalist government. Okay, initially the communists were part of it, but then Chiang Kai-shek would expel the communists and Mao Zedong and his supporters would go their own separate path. and eventually a full-blown conflict would ensue, so would break out. So China would be at war. So there would be civil war within China itself with these two parties, with these two uh, groups going against each other, the nationalists, the Kuomintang, and the communists. But for some time, the Kuomintang and the communists, they would agree to work together, okay, against the invader, against Japan. They would be helped by Russia. So again, looking at this in the context of the Second World War, sorry, while Japan held the east, the Kuomintang held the center and the west of the country. Like I already suggested before, you know, most most the great powers at this time did nothing. Okay, the League of Nations was powerless. And anyway, although members condemned Japanese actions, Japan withdrew from, canceled their membership. So in the end, the League of Nations could do nothing whatsoever. The USSR did not want war, an all-out war with a full-scale war with Japan, although they were helping the Chinese. They didn't want, a full-blown conflict. Great Britain and France were too busy, too preoccupied with Hitler at this time. And the US still held an isolationist position. They still remembered the experiences and the outcomes of the First World War. So they didn't want to commit troops, they didn't want to commit resources. But then there would be a turning point in 1941. American public opinion would shift as the Americans witnessed in horror the fall of France, and as the President of the US, Franklin Roosevelt, received intelligence that the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans were meeting secretly. They were entering into agreements, and you know, remember that the Germans entered into an anti-communist pact with Japan and Italy in 1937, and later on in 1940, they would agree um, to help each other in case of conflict with the US. So President Roosevelt was quite aware of these developments. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt's task was to convince the American people that the US had to get involved in these conflicts. And by the way, Roosevelt was already helping out the Russians by the 1940s, early 1940s, supplying the Russians with equipment, with food, with other supplies. Okay, but here let me just read this quotation. This is from a quotation from a public address delivered by Roosevelt on radio. Okay, as he was trying to convince the American people that it was in the interest of the U.S. to enter, to get involved in these conflicts. As you can read here, some of our people like to believe that wars in Europe and Asia are no concern of ours. But it is a matter of most vital concern to us that European and Asiatic war makers should not gain control of oceans, which lead to this hemisphere. So you're talking about the Pacific and Atlantic. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany, will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the high seas. All of us, including the Americans, would be living at the point of a gun. So Roosevelt lays out the stakes for the US, and we will see that they would make a decision after, the surprise attack of Japan on Pearl Harbor.